The Emperor of France was actually Italian. His DNA proved it. He conquered Europe in the name of France. He rewrote the laws of the civilized world. He made kings bow to him and empires crumble in a single afternoon. He was the most powerful man on earth for 15 years. And he was never, in any meaningful sense, French. His birth name was Napoleone di Buonaparte, Italian. His family were Genoese nobility. He spoke French for the rest of his life, with a thick Corsican accent that made Parisian aristocrats wince. When he wrote love letters in French, the grammar was imperfect. When he was furious, he swore in Corsican. He was born on an island that France had owned for exactly 1 year. And when scientists finally tested his DNA, from beard hairs preserved for 2 centuries in a reliquary in Paris, they found something that rewrote the story entirely. His paternal bloodline did not come from France. It did not come from Italy. It traced back 7,000 years to the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, to the land the Bible calls the Holy Land, to the ancient territory that is now Israel, Palestine and Lebanon. The Emperor of Europe had DNA from the cradle of civilization. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. This is the Italian DNA mystery. And this is where the story really begins. To understand Napoleon's DNA, we first need to understand what Italian DNA actually is. Because Italy is not one people. It never has been. The Italian Peninsula is one of the most genetically diverse regions in Europe, a crossroads of ancient migrations, sea routes and invasions stretching back 12,000 years. The oldest layer belongs to the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers who sheltered in Italy during the last ice age. Their genetic signature still appears in isolated mountain communities today. Then came the Anatolian farmers, the same Neolithic wave that shaped all of Western Europe. They crossed from modern Turkey around 8,000 years ago, bringing agriculture and the haplogroup G2A. They transformed the peninsula. Italy was one of their primary landing points in Europe. Then the steppe nomads, the Yamnaya, brought haplogroup R1b from the Pontic steppe around 3,000 years before Christ. But crucially, in southern Italy, Sardinia and Sicily, the steppe signal is weaker than almost anywhere else in Europe. The older Anatolian farmer, DNA, persisted here longer than almost anywhere on the continent. Then the Greeks colonized southern Italy, Magna Graecia, bringing haplogroups from the eastern Mediterranean. Then the Romans unified the peninsula, but also imported slaves, traders and soldiers from across their empire. Then the Lombards from Germany, the Normans from Scandinavia via France, the Arabs in Sicily, the Spanish in the south. Italy is a genetic archive of Western civilization. Every empire that ever mattered left its mark here. And Corsica, the island that produced Napoleon, is its own distinct chapter. Corsica shares its closest genetic profile with Sardinia rather than with mainland Italy or France. Both islands were settled early by Neolithic farmers and were relatively isolated from the later steppe migrations, preserving ancient Mediterranean genetic profiles. The haplogroup that turns out to be Napoleon's haplogroup is found at higher frequencies in Sardinia and Sicily than almost anywhere else in Western Europe, pointing to an ancient dispersal route from the Levant through Anatolia and into the islands. That thread leads eventually to a small town in Corsica called Ajaccio, and to a boy born there in the summer of 1769. Corsica sits in the Mediterranean between France and Italy, closer geographically to the Italian coast than to the French mainland. For most of its history, it was Italian, Genoese specifically, ruled by the Republic of Genoa for nearly 3 centuries. In 1768, the Republic of Genoa, exhausted by a decades-long Corsican independence rebellion, led by a man named Pasquale Paoli, sold the island to France. The price was 2 million livres. France got a mountain island full of people who had spent 30 years fighting for the right not to be governed by anyone. On the 15th of August 1769, exactly 1 year and 3 days after the French took legal control of Corsica, a woman named Maria Letizia Ramolino gave birth to her second surviving child in the town of Ajaccio. She named him Napoleone, after an uncle. The child was technically French. His island had been French for a year, but nobody in Ajaccio felt French. They felt Corsican, and the Ramolinos and the Buonapartes were among the most prominent Corsican-Italian families on the island. Pasquale Paoli, the independence leader the French had just defeated, was a personal hero to the family. The young Napoleone grew up wanting to be him. He wanted Corsican independence. He wrote essays about Paoli as a student. His earliest political ambition was not to conquer Europe. It was to free his island. History had other plans. The Bonaparte family, Buonaparte in their original Italian spelling, had been in Corsica since the 16th century, having emigrated from the Ligurian coast of Italy, the region around Genoa. They were minor nobility, not wealthy, but educated, respected, conscious of their lineage. Napoleon's father was Carlo Maria di Buonaparte, a lawyer, charming and politically agile, who managed to get the family recognised as French nobility after the island's annexation, which entitled his children to French royal scholarships. This single act of bureaucratic shrewdness changed history. It is the reason Napoleon went to military school in France. Carlo died young, in 1785, of stomach cancer, aged just 38. Napoleon was 15. He was now the eldest functioning male in a large family that included 8 surviving children and very little money. His mother was Maria Letizia Ramolino, called Madame Mère, Mother of the Emperor, in later life. She was arguably the most formidable person in the Bonaparte family. She outlived Napoleon. She outlived most of her children. She was alive when her son conquered Europe, and she was alive when he died in exile. She spent her final years in Rome, refusing to return to France, watching everything from a distance, with an expression that suggested she had always known it would end this way. She had 13 children. 8 survived to adulthood. Every single one of them became historically significant. This family's DNA was about to go everywhere. Napoleon was sent to the military academy at Brienne-le-Château in France at the age of 9. He spoke barely any French. He was mocked for his accent, his poverty, and his Corsican identity. He responded by becoming the best mathematician in his class, and by spending every free hour alone reading history. He read everything: Caesar, Alexander, Frederick the Great, Plutarch. He was building, in his own mind, a library of how to conquer. He graduated to the École Militaire in Paris in 1784, aged 14, a year younger than his classmates. Circumstances were about to favour him catastrophically. The French Revolution began in 1789. It destroyed the old officer class, which had been dominated by aristocratic birth. Suddenly, talent mattered more than family. An ambitious young artillery officer from Corsica, brilliant at mathematics, obsessively well-read in military history, willing to work harder than anyone around him, found every door open. In 1793, at the Siege of Toulon, a 24-year-old artillery captain named Napoleon Bonaparte positioned his guns in a place his superiors thought impossible, bombarded the British fleet from an angle nobody expected, and forced them to abandon the harbour. Toulon fell. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general within weeks. He was 24 years old. He would not stop for 22 years. In 1795, Napoleon met a widow named Rose de Beauharnais at a Paris salon. Her husband, a French aristocrat, had been guillotined during the Terror. She had survived the revolution through a combination of social skill, luck, and strategic friendship. Napoleon called her Josephine. She hated the name, but never quite managed to stop him using it. He was 26. She was 32, a widow with 2 children. She was sophisticated, experienced, and initially somewhat unimpressed by this intense, badly dressed Corsican, who wrote her letters that oscillated between military precision and near incoherent romantic passion. One letter reads, "I wake filled with thoughts of you. Your portrait and the intoxicating evening which we spent yesterday have left my senses in turmoil. Sweet, incomparable Josephine, what a strange effect you have on my heart." She had affairs, multiple ones. The marriage was tempestuous, passionate, and in its strange way, genuine on both sides. They had no children together. Napoleon had illegitimate children, proving his fertility, which meant the difficulty lay on Josephine's side. For an emperor who needed an heir, this was an impossible situation. He waited 13 years before acting on it. In December 1809, Napoleon divorced Josephine. He was 40 years old. The scene, by all accounts, destroyed them both. She died in May 1814, just as Napoleon was being exiled to Elba. He heard the news on the island and locked himself in his room for 3 days. His last words, spoken as he died 7 years later, were, "France, the army, Josephine." In that order. One of the most extraordinary facts about Napoleon's story is what he did with his family. He did not just conquer Europe, he staffed it with Bonapartes. His brother Joseph became King of Naples in 1806, then King of Spain in 1808. He was affable, decent, and entirely unsuited to ruling a country in the middle of a vicious guerrilla war. The Spanish never accepted him. His brother Louis became King of Holland in 1806. Louis made the catastrophic error of actually caring about the Dutch. When Napoleon ordered him to enforce the continental blockade, cutting Britain off from European trade, Louis refused because it was destroying his subjects' livelihoods. Napoleon eventually abolished the Kingdom of Holland entirely and absorbed it into France. Louis abdicated and left. Their son, Louis Napoleon, would later become Napoleon III of France. His brother Jerome became King of Westphalia in 1807, a newly created kingdom carved out of German territory. Jerome was charming, extravagant, and primarily interested in parties. He managed to keep his throne until the whole Napoleonic structure collapsed in 1813. It is through Jerome's descendants that Napoleon's Y chromosome survives in living people today. His sisters did not escape either. Elisa became Grand Duchess of Tuscany. Caroline married Marshal Murat and became Queen of Naples. Pauline, considered the most beautiful of the Bonapartes, became Princess of Guastalla and famously posed without clothing for the sculptor Canova, producing what remains one of the most celebrated marble sculptures in existence. When asked whether she had been comfortable posing, she reportedly said the studio was very warm. And his brother Lucien, the one with actual political intelligence comparable to Napoleon himself, fell out with him over a marriage Napoleon disapproved of, refused to be a puppet king, and spent most of the empire years in exile in Italy and England, watching from a distance. He outlived Napoleon. The Bonaparte DNA was in Spain, Holland, Westphalia, Tuscany, Naples. It was, for 15 years, the ruling bloodline of Western Europe. Before we continue, we need to address the most persistent lie in European history. Napoleon was not short. French medical records, taken after his death at St. Helena, recorded his height as 5 feet 2 inches. British newspapers, cartoonists and propagandists seized on this and never let go. The caricaturist James Gilray depicted a tiny, furious man in an enormous hat, raging at the world from ankle height. The image stuck for 2 centuries. The problem is, those measurements were in French units. A French pouce, the French word for inch, is not the same as an English inch. It is 2.71 centimetres, not 2.54. 5 feet 2 inches in French measurement equals approximately 5 feet 6.5 inches in English measurement. 168 centimetres, exactly average for a French man of his era. Multiple other measurements taken during his lifetime give figures between 5 feet 6 and 5 feet 7 in English units. His imperial guard had a minimum height requirement of 5 feet 10. He was shorter than his own guard. In every painting and official portrait, he is surrounded by enormous men. The visual impression of smallness was real. The smallness was not. The nickname Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, was a term of affection used by his soldiers. It referred to his willingness to share their hardships, to sleep in the mud beside them, to eat what they ate. It was not a comment on his height. History, written by the victors, is sometimes written with a ruler. In March 1796, Napoleon was given command of the Army of Italy. It was the worst assignment in the French military, an underfed, under-equipped, demoralised force facing Austrian armies across the Alps. In 12 months, he fought 12 major battles. He won all of them. He crossed the Alps, outmanoeuvred Austrian generals twice his age, captured Milan, besieged Mantua, and forced Austria to sign the Treaty of Campo Formio, surrendering the Austrian Netherlands, Lombardy, and recognising French influence across northern Italy. He was 27 years old. France went mad for him. He came home a hero. His Egyptian campaign followed. He took an army and a team of scientists to Egypt, defeated the Mamluk cavalry at the Battle of the Pyramids in the shadow of the ancient monuments, and had the Rosetta Stone discovered under his command, the key that would eventually unlock the entire ancient Egyptian language. Then Admiral Horatio Nelson found his fleet anchored in Abu Qir Bay and destroyed it. The Battle of the Nile annihilated French naval power in the Mediterranean. Napoleon's army was stranded in Egypt. He eventually slipped away, effectively abandoning his men, and returned to France, where political crisis gave him the opportunity he needed. In November 1799, in a coup called the 18th Brumaire, Napoleon seized power. He was 30 years old. He was now First Consul of France. Within 5 years he would crown himself emperor. Many historians consider the Battle of Austerlitz the greatest tactical performance in the history of warfare. Napoleon himself considered it his masterpiece. He faced a combined Austrian and Russian force on the 2nd of December 1805, the first anniversary of his coronation. Emperor Francis II of Austria and Tsar Alexander I of Russia. 2 emperors against 1. Their army outnumbered his. They held the high ground on the Pratzen Heights and believed they had him trapped. He wanted them to believe exactly that. He deliberately weakened his right flank, inviting them to attack it. When they committed their strongest forces to the assault, he struck the centre, the Pratzen Heights, with everything he had. He broke the Allied centre in 45 minutes. Then he turned the 2 halves of their army against each other. By the end of the day, the coalition had lost 36,000 men. Napoleon lost 9,000. 2 emperors fled the battlefield. The Treaty of Pressburg followed. Austria surrendered territory across Italy and Germany. The Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that had existed for over 1,000 years, was dissolved the following year. Napoleon had not just defeated an army, he had erased an empire. 6 weeks before Austerlitz, Britain had struck the blow that would ultimately define the limits of his power. Admiral Horatio Nelson, aboard HMS Victory, met the combined French and Spanish fleet off Cape Trafalgar on the 21st of October 1805. He broke every rule of naval warfare. Instead of the conventional parallel line, he sailed directly into the enemy fleet in 2 perpendicular columns, cutting their line, creating chaos at close range, and destroying or capturing 22 ships without losing a single British vessel. Nelson was shot by a French sniper during the battle and died below decks as his victory was confirmed. He knew he had won before he died. Trafalgar meant Napoleon could never invade Britain. The English Channel was now permanent protection. For the remaining decade of his reign, Napoleon controlled most of Europe by land. Britain controlled the world by sea. Neither could destroy the other, and that stalemate would eventually destroy him. After divorcing Josephine in 1809, Napoleon married Marie-Louise, daughter of Emperor Francis I of Austria, the man he had defeated 3 times in battle. She was 18, he was 40. She had been raised to consider Napoleon a monster, and yet, by most accounts, she found him acceptable, perhaps even pleasant. He was attentive, considerate, and perfectly capable of charm in private. On the 20th of March, 1811, she gave him what Josephine could not, a son, Napoleon François Joseph Charles Bonaparte, given the title King of Rome at birth, Napoleon's heir. Napoleon reportedly wept when the boy was born. He had waited his entire adult life for this moment. He saw his son for the last time in January 1814, when the boy was not yet 3 years old. When Napoleon was exiled to Elba, Marie-Louise took the child to Vienna and never returned. She fell in love with her Austrian escort and never went back to her husband. Napoleon wrote letters from St. Helena asking to see his son. They were not delivered. The Russian campaign of 1812 is the turning point of Napoleon's story. Everything before it was conquest. Everything after it was collapse. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. Somewhere between 450,000 and 680,000 soldiers from across his empire and allied states. He crossed the Niemen River into Russia on the 24th of June. The Russians did not fight him. They retreated. And as they retreated, they burned everything behind them. Every village, every granary, every barn. The scorched earth policy. An army that size could not live off the land it was crossing, because the land had been destroyed. On the 7th of September, at Borodino, the Russians finally turned and fought. It was the bloodiest single day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. Approximately 75,000 men died or were wounded in one day. Napoleon held the field at the end, but he did not have enough reserves to deliver the decisive blow that would have ended the war. On the 14th of September, he entered Moscow. It was already burning. The Russians had set fire to their own city rather than surrender it. He waited. For 5 weeks he waited, expecting the peace offer that never came. Tsar Alexander did not negotiate. On the 19th of October, Napoleon began the retreat. Winter came early and savagely. Men froze, horses died. When they crossed the Berezina River in late November, the bridge collapsed under desperate men. By December, what was left of the Grande Armée staggered back across the Niemen River. Fewer than 100,000 of the original force returned, perhaps as few as 80,000. The rest were dead, captured, or missing in the Russian winter. Europe looked at what Russia had done to Napoleon's invincible army and understood that he could be beaten. After exile on the island of Elba, Napoleon returned to France in March 1815. He walked off a ship with 1,100 men and marched on Paris. Every regiment sent to stop him instead joined him. He entered the capital without firing a single shot. The 100 days had begun. He had one chance. If he could defeat the Allied armies in Belgium before they fully assembled, he might yet survive. On the 18th of June, 1815, At a farm near the village of Waterloo in Belgium, Napoleon attacked the Duke of Wellington's British and Allied force. Wellington held. Napoleon's Imperial Guard, the finest soldiers in Europe, never previously defeated in a pitched battle, attacked the ridge at the end of the day and was thrown back. Then the Prussian army of Field Marshal Blücher arrived on Napoleon's flank. He had been fighting since dawn. He had no reserves. The French army broke. Napoleon abdicated 4 days later. He was exiled to St. Helena, a remote British island in the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles from the African coast, specifically chosen because it was impossible to escape from. He was 45 years old. He would never leave. Napoleon died on the 5th of May, 1821. He was 51 years old. Official cause? Stomach cancer. He had been complaining of stomach pain for years. He had lost enormous weight. He was pale, lethargic, weakening. But modern science has added a disturbing dimension. Analysis of Napoleon's hair, multiple samples from different periods of his life, has found arsenic levels between 10 and 38 times higher than normal. This is not a small anomaly. 3 explanations compete. The first, deliberate poisoning. The British who held him prisoner had clear political motivation. Some historians argue this was systematic assassination, slow, deniable, impossible to prove at the time. The second, accidental poisoning from his environment. The wallpaper at Longwood House, his residence on St. Helena, used a green dye containing arsenic, common in Victorian-era interiors. In the damp conditions of the island, mould can convert arsenic in wallpaper into a toxic vapour. Analysis of a piece of that wallpaper has confirmed it contained arsenic. He was breathing it. The third, his doctors. Calomel, mercury chloride, was a common medication of the era, often contaminated with arsenic. He was being treated with it heavily in his final months. The most likely answer is the second and third combined. Environmental arsenic compounded by medical arsenic, with his already compromised body unable to process either. Whether anyone deliberately added to the load remains unproven. He died in considerable pain, asking for his son. His last words were, France, the army, Josephine. Napoleon Francois Joseph Charles Bonaparte, Napoleon II, the King of Rome, never ruled anywhere. After his father's first abdication in 1814, the child was taken to Vienna by his mother and raised at the Austrian court. He was given the title Duke of Reichstadt by his grandfather, Emperor Francis. He was called l'Aiglon, the Little Eagle, by French Bonapartists, who saw him as the legitimate heir to his father's throne. He grew up tall, handsome, and quietly melancholy. He spoke German. He wore Austrian uniforms. He was kept away from anything French, anything Bonapartist, anything that might remind him or anyone else of what his name meant. He died on the 22nd of July, 1832. He was 21 years old. Tuberculosis. He had never married. He had no children. Napoleon's direct male line ended with a 21-year-old who had spent his entire short life as a beautiful gilded prisoner in his grandfather's court. Before we reach the DNA, we need to account for what Napoleon actually built, because the legacy is not only military. The Napoleonic Code, signed into law in 1804, is one of the most influential legal documents in human history. It codified civil law on principles of equality before the law, property rights, freedom of religion, and the abolition of feudal privilege. It replaced centuries of contradictory regional laws, noble privileges, and ecclesiastical courts with a single rational system. The Code still forms the foundation of legal systems in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Quebec, Louisiana, Romania, Egypt, and across Latin America. When you sign a contract in Montreal or pursue a legal dispute in New Orleans, you are operating inside a legal framework that Napoleon built. He established the Bank of France. He created the French lycée system, the framework of secondary education that still produces graduates today. He built roads across Europe, many of which are still in use. He standardized weights and measures across his empire, accelerating the eventual adoption of the metric system across the world. And everywhere his armies went, they carried the principles of the revolution: equality, meritocracy, the end of hereditary privilege, the abolition of serfdom, the idea that a man's birth should not determine his destiny. The man who conquered Europe by force planted seeds of liberty that his enemies could not uproot. Now, the DNA. Scientists extracted genetic material from beard hairs belonging to Napoleon, preserved in the Vivant des Noms Reliquary, a collection assembled by the Director General of French Museums under Napoleon, which includes hairs authenticated as his. They compared the results against a living descendant, Charles Napoleon, born in 1950, a patrilineal descendant of Napoleon's brother Jerome through 4 generations. The profiles matched. The hairs were genuine. Napoleon's Y chromosome haplogroup is E1, B1, B1, C1, specifically the subclade known as EM34. What does this mean? EM34 originated approximately 7,000 years ago on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, the southern Levant, the region that is now Israel, Palestine and Lebanon. This is not the haplogroup of a Frenchman. It is not even typical of Italians. It is found today at highest frequencies in the eastern Mediterranean, with populations in Israel, Jordan and Lebanon carrying it most commonly. How did it get to Corsica? The haplogroup's distribution tells the story. From the Levant, it spread north through Anatolia, modern Turkey, then jumped to the islands of the central Mediterranean, Sicily, Sardinia. Both carry EM34 at frequencies significantly higher than mainland Europe. From there it reached Corsica, and in a Corsican family of Genoese-Italian origin, it reached Carlo di Buonaparte, and then his son. The man who called himself Emperor of the French, King of Italy, Protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, carried the genetic signature of the ancient Near East, a migration that happened 5,000 years before France existed, 3,000 years before Rome. His grey-blue eyes did not come from that haplogroup. His dark hair did not come from it. Haplogroup is paternal lineage, one line, one thread, stretching back through thousands of years and thousands of men. It tells us where one branch of his ancestry came from. It does not tell us everything. But it tells us something extraordinary. Napoleon Bonaparte was, in one genetic thread, a descendant of the ancient peoples of the Holy Land. There is one more piece of this story that connects Napoleon's DNA to the era he lived in. Napoleonic military records, the conscription lists from his era, recorded the eye colour of every enlisted soldier in the French army. At the beginning of the 19th century, 59% of French soldiers had blue or grey eyes. 28% had green or light brown. Only 13% had dark brown eyes. By 1940, that figure for dark brown eyes had risen to 46%. That shift from 13 to 46% in a century and a half is the genetic fingerprint of mass immigration into France. The same layering of populations this channel has traced across European DNA history. Napoleon himself had grey-blue eyes. The man with the Near Eastern Y chromosome had Northern European coloured eyes. Because DNA is not a simple equation. One genetic thread does not determine the whole person. Haplogroup tells you where one paternal line comes from. It does not tell you what colour your eyes will be, or your hair, or the shape of your face. Napoleon was the genetic crossroads of Western civilization in a single body. Near Eastern paternal line, Mediterranean island birth, Italian family, French empire. Grey-blue eyes looking out over a continent he had remade. Napoleon died on St. Helena. He had spent 6 years on the island. He had dictated his memoirs, rewritten his own legend, constructed the image of himself that he wanted history to preserve. The account of his life he gave in exile became one of the best-selling books of the 19th century. He was dead and still shaping his own story. The Napoleonic myth never died. The dynasty Napoleon built returned through the line of his brother Louis. The legal systems he created are still in force. The roads his engineers built are still in use. The schools his reforms established still graduate students. The metric system he spread across his empire is now used by most of the world. Napoleon was not French. He was not just Corsican. He was not just Italian. He was, in the most literal genetic sense, older than all of it.